So I'm going to talk about what the Big Five can predict, and I'll tell you some things about introversion, extroversion, but I'm focusing on all the Big Five traits. And I decided to pick two things that I think most of us would consider very important to how our lives turn out. Who you find as a life partner. For most of us, that's one of the most important decisions. And then what career you pursue and whether you're successful in your career. And what I'll be doing is describing two classic studies, landmark studies that everyone knows about, and then two more recent studies related to the same theme. To begin, the example I like to use is last summer. I have 5 nephews and nieces. The oldest one is now 29 years old. And last summer, he got married. So my wife and my daughter and I and my brother and sister and my mom, we all went to the wedding. And because I am the way I am, when I go to a wedding, I'm trying to figure out whether the couple is well matched and whether their marriage is going to be a happy one that will last a long time. So what I knew about my nephew and the girl he's marrying is that they met in Boston. They were both doing a PhD. I don't know exactly how they met, but I know that they're both great academically. I know they go to church together. She was actually studying religion, and they go to a Catholic church together every week. And that actually surprised me. I wouldn't have guessed that my nephew would still be going to church. I know that when President Trump got elected, they went to Washington and marched in the parade for women, in support of women. It was like 1 million people went there, so I know they're politically active. And I also know that they're runners and weightlifters, and they're really into fitness. So they have a lot of shared activities, and all of that I would think, boy, that's good. But the thing is, I know about personality too. So, and I know about some of the findings that I'll tell you about. So I pay attention to what level of neuroticism they have. And I think both of them are at least medium or a little higher than medium. I pay attention to conscientiousness and agreeableness. And I'll show you some evidence that suggests the Big Five traits can play a role in how marriages evolve. So that's what I'll try to do now. So the most famous study in this area was begun 80 years ago. In 1938, there was a psychologist named Lowell Kelly who was interested in finding a large number of couples who were engaged to be married. And he wanted to assess their personality, and he wanted to see whether personality and compatibility played a role in how people's marriages developed and changed over time. He had intended it to be only like a 5 or 10 year study. But he started with 300 engaged couples. And he did something that hardly anyone would do now. He measured personality in a very systematic, intensive way. Each person in the couple identified 5 people who knew them well. And those 5 people completed a variety of personality scales. So The data that I'll describe is not based on self-report at all. It's based on how other people see you. And of course, because there's 5 raters, there's some reliability there, and you can calculate a mean among the raters and kind of trust that you're getting at the true consistencies in social and emotional behavior. Now, besides the big 5 traits, he also assessed attitudes, values, religious belief, and I was kind of shocked. It was 1938, but there were many questions about sexual history, sexual practices you prefer, sexual things you really like. It was pretty interesting reading, but the idea there was that things about sexual experience and sexual interests may play a role in how the marriage would develop. So there were many non-personality factors. So he followed people up every year for the first 5 years, but then World War II happened, and the researcher got involved in personality testing for the military. They didn't follow up the people any further, and he didn't even write up many of the findings. There was also a problem in that the scales he used, he did this before there was a big 5. So he gave a 60-item personality scale and then another personality scale, and he ended up with like 20 different trait measures. And it was very hard to make sense of which traits were important and which ones you should focus on. So it was only 20 to 25 years later when the big 5 had emerged and it was clear that you could reorganize all these trait terms, that a younger researcher contacted him and said, can we go back and look at this data again? Can we take all of these trait terms and reconstitute the big 5 and get a score on the big 5 for every person in your study? And part of that plan was also to contact the participants again and see whether, actually at 20 years, Lowell Kelly followed up the people himself, and that was still before the big 5 traits had emerged. It was at 50 years, so in the 1970s, when the big 5 had emerged and were very clear, that another researcher, Conley, contacted him and said, let's bring some order to this. So the data I'll tell you about is based on the 20 and 50-year follow-ups. And of the 300 participants, 20 of them never even got married. They were engaged, but they never made it to the altar. About 40 to 50 got divorced. So only about 20% got divorced, because this is back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and divorce was not as socially acceptable as it is now. So the key outcomes that Kelly and Conley wanted to focus on were whether people got divorced and also how happy and satisfied people were in their lives. Because only 40 to 50 couples got divorced, they decided to create what they called a marital misery index, where if you got divorced, that would be coded as you having a miserable marriage. Whereas if you stayed together but hated each other, that would also be coded as a miserable marriage. And there were gradations on that. So there were people who stayed together and were very happily married, people who got divorced, and then people who stayed together with varying ranges of happiness. And the key question is, can the big five traits predict marital outcomes 20 years and 50 years into the future? And even more important, these researchers wanted to show that personality traits could predict outcomes over and above non-personality characteristics. So they knew the participants' socioeconomic status. SES is a big predictor of divorce and marital happiness. In fact, all of us are kind of fortunate because the rates of divorce, in the United States at least, for people who are on the lower half of SES is about 50%. Every new marriage, there's a 50% chance it will end in divorce. But for highly educated, college educated, it's only 25%. So SES is a big predictor of marital outcomes. Shared religious beliefs is a big predictor. Some other values and attitudes are predictors. These researchers used a statistical technique called multiple regression analysis, where you could first control for SES, religious beliefs, sexual history, and all those kinds of things. And after you've controlled for that, you could see whether the big five traits have an effect. And what they found is that SES, religious beliefs, and certain life events, so if someone had an illness or a baby died or something happened like that, those things all had a significant impact on increasing the chances that the marriage would have troubles. But over and above all of these life events and non-personality factors, they found that two of the big five traits were significantly related to marital outcomes over the next 50 years. The most important was neuroticism. I've described that for you before. It's a broad trait that has to do with variability and negative emotions. Probably the most defining terms for neuroticism would be anxious, worried. This was the number one predictor. It was actually, I think, stronger than religious beliefs and life events. And importantly, for neuroticism, it was both the neuroticism of the husband and the neuroticism of the wife. So if by chance the husband and wife were both higher on neuroticism, that increases the odds of divorce or of a miserable marriage. The size of this relation is equal to about a Pearson correlation of 0.20. In most of the studies you'll hear about in social and personality psychology, you know that Pearson correlations can range from -1 to +1. 0 would indicate that there's no relation. In the social sciences, we're usually dealing with Pearson correlations of between 0.10 and 0.30. 0.20 is quite a strong effect, especially over 50 years. So that neuroticism does seem to be an important thing. Now, the other personality trait that played a role was conscientiousness, But it was only the husband's level of conscientiousness. And the way that worked was low conscientiousness was predictive of divorce and unhappiness in marriages. Now, you probably know this, but in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, society was very different. In most families, only the man worked, and the moms were more likely to stay at home. These were all heterosexual couples. They were all white. There was a wide SES. But in those days, the husband was the breadwinner in most cases. That might explain why it's only the husband's level of conscientiousness that was predictive. Okay, so the conclusion was that with an important outcome like marital stability, marital success, personality traits may play a role. There were two other findings that I'll tell you about. They're not as famous, but I think it's interesting from a psychological point of view. They also did a sub-analysis of only the people who didn't get divorced. And they were interested in why people would stay in an unhappy marriage. So they did an analysis where they tried to predict which kind of personalities would lead you to remain married to someone who you don't get along with and who isn't satisfying what you want in your life. And they found effects, but only for men. You know, because of when this study was done, I think the effects for women weren't as clear as they might be now. But for men, they found two personality characteristics that predicted a tendency to stay in marriages despite the fact that they were unhappy and bitter. It wasn't neuroticism. It wasn't conscientiousness. So there's only three traits left: openness, agreeableness, and extroversion. And remember, all of these are bipolar. So think about open versus conventional. Think about agreeable versus quarrelsome. And think about introverted versus extrovert. Which kind of men would stay in an unhappy marriage? Boy, that makes good sense, but that's not what they found. But, you know, if I had to register my hypothesis like they do nowadays, hearing that, I would have registered that hypothesis. But openness isn't the one. So it's the other two, but you have to figure out which side. Yeah. So most people think it's the agreeable people because they're accommodating and harmonious. And this gives me an opportunity to remind you that that's not really what agreeableness is all about. That's actually more submissiveness, being willing to put up with what others are doing and not speaking up. And that's the low end of social dominance, which is part of extroversion. So when we think someone's being pushed around by their spouse, or they're being whipped by their spouse, emotionally whipped, that's not agreeableness. That's submissiveness, and that's low extroversion, or that's the introversion end. And that was predictive. So men who were highly introverted And I think it's mostly because they're submissive and they lack assertiveness. They stayed in miserable marriages. So we have one trait left, quarrelsome versus agreeable. Oh, you've already said that. Yeah. It turns out it's the quarrelsome men who were content to stay in an unhappy marriage. And that's surprising. These are combative, conflictful-oriented guys who are sarcastic, cynical. But in the last 20 years, there's evidence that agreeable people, when they behave in friendly, kind ways, they experience more positive affect and less negative affect. Quarrelsome people, believe it or not, experience relatively more positive affect when they get to quarrel, when they get to have some combative relationships. So there's some evidence now that depending where you are on this dimension, you might actually like a more conflictful kind of relationship style. And if you like conflict and combat, there's few better places than an unhappy, miserable marriage. Now, this is a post hoc explanation. The researchers didn't say that, but I know, and I'll tell you about this research in a couple weeks, where it seems that, there's something about behaving truly with your personality trait standing that has an affective effect, even if we're at what we think of as the more negative end. Yeah. So they've rated their marriages very unhappy. So it wasn't as if they said, boy, my wife and I have a great give and take, we're very equal. No, the men were saying, my wife is a shrew, I don't know why I married her. So, yeah, that's a good point, though. So the marital satisfaction was a different kind of rating. It's like, is this a good, happy marriage, or is it not? They were saying it's not, but they stayed in it. But at some deeper level, maybe it was appealing to their personality. Okay, so those are the findings. I think the key ones are neuroticism and maybe conscientiousness. So I'm now thinking about my nephew and his wife. As I said, I'm afraid both of them are a little bit higher on neuroticism. They've been married 1.5 years and they've already had some difficulties, mostly about deciding where they were going to locate and what kind of jobs to take. Conscientiousness, they're both off the scale on conscientiousness. They're both pretty extroverted, but that doesn't really play out here. But the fact that they're both pretty high on neuroticism, these findings suggest that there's a tendency. It doesn't mean that in every case the more neurotic people will have more problems, but there's a tendency in that direction. Okay, so that's the classic study. Now I'll tell you about a more recent study. And this was done by the two leading researchers in the Big Five. That's Paul Costa and Robert McRae and Paul Costa. For the last 40 years, they've been doing longitudinal studies. They're the leading experts. They're at the National Institute of Health. And they're kind of the guiding forces of all of the research that's exploded. So I thought it would be interesting to show you some of their more recent work. And rather than looking at outcomes, what they wanted to get a handle on is how people pair off. So there's a phenomenon called assortative mating, where the idea is that we choose people who are similar to ourselves, and then genetically this increases the likelihood that your kids will be similar as well. So in terms of height, for example, people pair off in terms of height. There are other characteristics. People do tend to pair off by choosing someone from the same cultural, ethnic background, choosing people from the same religion. But the question is, do we do it with personality? I'd rather get through it first. And so, you might think, okay, if I'm an extrovert, what kind of person would I do well with as a romantic partner? Another extrovert? Or is it better to have someone who complements me? There's only so much oxygen in a room. Maybe it should be an extrovert and an introvert. Or with a quarrelsome person, do you need a highly agreeable person to kind of get along? So this particular study was gigantic. It was like thousands of participants, married couples from 4 different countries, from Holland, the United States, Czechoslovakia, Russia. I'm showing you the results for the Dutch sample, but generally across all of the samples, the results were very similar. I'm showing you the results for the whole sample, and then I split it by the younger married couples and the older married couples. Can anyone guess why it might be interesting to split by young versus old in terms of looking at how similar a couple is? What can you learn from an older couple that's different from a younger couple? Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, a cohort effect. These researchers didn't even consider that, but that's a really good idea. Yeah? Exactly. Like they say, if you have a dog, you begin to look like your dog, or something like that, or 2 people who are married begin to look like each other. The question is, by living with someone 20, 30, 40 years, do your personalities begin to get more similar? So that's why you can figure out by looking separately at the older sample. Now, in this figure that I'm showing you, the similarity statistic is the correlation between the husband and the wife's score on the same trait dimension. So here's neuroticism of the husband, neuroticism of the wife. The correlation is plus 0.13. That's significant at 0.001. That means that there is matching. It's not a powerful correlation, but to some extent, we're more likely to end up with someone who's at the same level of neuroticism. So if I'm highly stable, it's likely my wife is like that too. If I'm at the neurotic end, my partner will be more neurotic. Now, if you look at extroversion, it's the same thing. So there's no evidence that extroverts seek out introverts. There's no complementarity. Instead, you get the similarity effect. You also get it for openness, you get it for agreeableness, and you get it for conscientiousness. So across the board, the most striking thing is that we seem to sort ourselves out into marital couples with others who are somewhat similar to ourselves. I would just note that there's one big 5 trait where the effect is stronger than for all the others. And that's openness. And openness is interesting because, Well, first of all, it's a hard trait. I think of all the big five, it's the hardest one to figure out what it's really getting at. But it's the only one that's like strongly associated with education and IQ. And it also, you'll read this in McAdams, openness is very much associated with your attitudes, your values, your political beliefs. So if you're high in openness to experience, you're much more likely on the left liberal end of the political spectrum. If you're on the conventional end of openness, you're more toward the conservative right end of the political spectrum. So it could be that openness is especially strongly related because many of us do choose our partners based on political things or religious things. Like, for example, if I was not married and if I met someone, I'd have a very hard time marrying someone who's a strong Trump supporter because I'm very much on the left end of the political spectrum. So if I choose people based on political attitudes, religious attitudes, it's quite possible that openness is figuring into that. Okay. So in that particular study, it was cross-sectional. They didn't follow people over time. There are other studies. You'll read in McAdams. There are newer studies on marital relationships. And my sense is neuroticism has held up as an important predictor. Okay. So